Hi, and welcome to Module 1 of Self-Care While Grieving. I'm Kelly Daugherty, and in this module, we're going to talk about grief information. Grief is a normal response to loss. It's the feelings associated with the loss. It is not one specific feeling. Grief is a mix of feelings: sadness, anger, guilt, loneliness, confusion, frustration, and so many more. And some talk about it being like this tangled ball of emotions because it just feels like so much. There's so many different things. Each person's grief is unique. Each person is going to grieve differently. And the reason that is the case is because relationships are different. And so each relationship we have, we're going to grieve differently. There's other factors that may impact grief as well. And that comes down to how the person died. Was it sudden? Was it anticipated? Was it a child? Was it an older adult? Was this something traumatic that caused, like suicide or overdose or an accident? How old were you when you were grieving? What is the support that you've received? Unfortunately, many people talk about that they don't receive great support from friends and family. There's actually a research article that's out that talks about that animals are what people report as that they're most highly satisfied with the level of support that they've received from their pets and animals. About, like, I think it's about 78% compared to about 20% for friends and family. So animals are important. We also look at other factors that may impact grief: the relationship with the deceased. Was there unfinished business? Was there some ambivalence in that relationship? Was it conflicted? Religious beliefs impact how you grieve. Some people find comfort in seeking out religious and spiritual beliefs, and that helps them on their grief. Others don't. Also, our cultures. Everybody grieves differently throughout the whole world. Some cultures are better at it than others about how to help themselves with their grief. Men and women grieve very differently as well. And then also life experiences. Is this your first significant loss that you've experienced, or have you experienced multiple? And each one of those is going to probably grieve differently. And then how do you normally cope? What is your typical personality? What is your attachment style? All of these things may impact how somebody grieves. About 2.5 million people die in the United States every year. And there's some estimates that that means about 5 to 10 people are left grieving for that person. I think that's a pretty low number. I've seen it really impacts so many people. Just because somebody we may not be super close to doesn't mean that we don't grieve for them. I know I've had some friends in my life that have died, and it may have not felt the same as it did when my mom died. I still certainly grieve for them, and I still miss them. We also know that 1 in 12 children will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by the time they're 18 years old. And that does not include all of the children that are grieving a grandparent, another family member, a friend, a community member. So there's a lot of grieving children out there. We're going to talk about different types of grief. So that acute grief, that's that right after somebody dies. Those are the early grief symptoms, the strong feelings, the disbelief, the yearning. We also talk about anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is grief that we may have when there's an anticipated loss, when somebody's on hospice, or we know that somebody is going to die. We grieve prior to their death as well. Doesn't mean that after they die, it makes it any easier. It may, some, but it can be just as difficult once they die. Then we talk about disenfranchised grief. This is a type of grief that isn't necessarily widely accepted in our society. It's maybe minimized. Pet loss is one of those. I also think miscarriage is one of those. Also there's a lot of stigma around overdose loss, and this can be definitely a type of disenfranchised grief. Then we also talk about ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief. And this comes down to presence. So there is the physical absence, but with the psychological presence. So somebody that's missing, psychologically they're present, but physically we are not close to them and cannot find them. And then there's the psychological absence with physical presence, where their brain is starting to go, but physically they're here. Somebody with Alzheimer's, somebody maybe with a brain injury, maybe somebody with chronic mental illness. We also talk about non-finite loss, and this is when life doesn't meet our expectations, where we thought we were going to have this goal, maybe this goal of having a family and having children, and then the woman is unable to get pregnant. And so this goals of what she thought her future was going to be look like, she has to grieve for it. And then we have cumulative grief. This is grief that's kind of compounded, where we don't even have the opportunity to grieve one loss and then another loss happens. So it's really cumulative and can be really difficult because it's multiple losses. And then we also have delayed grief. Some people just want to push their grief away. Unfortunately, that's not something we can really do. It tends to come back at maybe a different part of our lives. I've seen it happen to somebody even 30 years later because of facing their own mortality, their grief resurfaced and came back up. So delayed grief, of course, we don't want to feel grief, but what you're probably going to hear me say a bunch throughout this course is that you do need to lean into your grief. You need to feel it. That is part of the process. And so we have different types of grievers. We have the instrumental grievers. These are the ones that want to do something with their grief. These are the people that maybe start the foundations or scholarships in memory of their loved one. And then we have the intuitive grievers. These are the ones that need to process it, that want to talk about their grief. And then we have about a blended type, right? A little bit of each. So what are grief symptoms? Well, we experience emotional symptoms, behavioral, spiritual, physical, and cognitive. And that can look like grief brain, where you can't focus, you can't concentrate. You may have physical symptoms like stomach aches or headaches or back aches or becoming really dizzy or shaky. You could have spiritual symptoms where you're angry at God or questioning what happens when somebody dies. The emotional symptoms, that's a wide range: hopelessness, disbelief, anxiety, those highs and lows where one moment you're feeling okay and the next you're not. And then we have the behavioral symptoms, maybe not being able to sleep, maybe wanting to stay in bed, the loss of motivation, maybe not being as focused at work, maybe drinking too much, maybe being too active, wanting to stay so busy that you avoid your grief. So one of the things I want to talk about is that there is no stages of grief. Grief is a normal, natural process, and there's not this neat little thing that we can go through. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed the 5 stages for people that were actively dying. And this theory then was transferred to grief and loss. And unfortunately, it's not accurate. It's never been proven. And it actually can make people think they're doing their grief wrong. So this is something that I avoid talking about with clients. And so you will not hear me talk about the 5 stages because it's just not accurate or helpful. And I tend to follow other models that I believe are more helpful, like Warden's tasks of grief. 1, to accept the reality of the loss. That's not a one-time thing, that's ongoing. 2, to experience the pain of the grief. Like I mentioned, you have to lean into that grief. You need to feel it. 3, to adjust in the environment where the deceased is missing. Wow, our brain is so like, wait a minute, they're supposed to be here. Where are they? Or something comes up. We walk into a house and, oh, wait a minute, our loved one is supposed to be there and we're not. We have to adjust to all these changes. And then the 4th one is to find an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. And what that means is, how do we keep our connection to our loved one even though they're gone? Continuing bonds. And how do we continue to move forward? So we're going to be talking some about resilience. And I want to be clear that in helping you understand that I'm not saying that this is a bouncing back, right? We always tend to think of resilience as bouncing back. That's not what I believe is resilient grieving. Resilient grieving is a healthy adaptation to loss. How do we take this grief and adapt it into our lives while still being able to live a meaningful, fulfilling life, while still holding on to that grief? Our grief doesn't get smaller over time. We get bigger than our grief. And so these are some things that I think are important for you to understand about grief, that each person's grief journey is unique. It is going to be different. Even 2 people that have a similar loss are going to grieve differently, and that's okay. And One of the other models that I really enjoy is the dual process model, which talks about loss oriented, where you're really feeling your grief, and then restoration oriented, where you start making changes, doing new things, maybe taking breaks from your grief, which is also okay to do. And then there's lines that go back and forth because that's what grief really looks like. One moment you're over here bawling your eyes out, and then the next you're laughing. And you're like, wait a minute, am I losing my mind? And then you're back to the crying. This is all very normal. So whatever you may be feeling is very normal. If you need additional support, please find a good grief counselor. Make sure somebody is grief informed. Unfortunately, not all therapists are. So making sure that you reach out to maybe somebody from hospice. Hospice offers free grief counseling, usually for a year following a loss, to most community members, even if their loved one hadn't been part of hospice. So if you're needing additional support, please reach out to hospice or another grief counselor. There is many grief groups throughout the country. There is also grief camps for children and many children's grief programs that are amazing. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please call 911, use the crisis text line 988, or go to the emergency room. If you're having thoughts that you want to hurt yourself, please contact somebody, reach out for support, and get the help you need because this is difficult. And so in our next module, we're going to move on to coping tools and the skills that can help you with your self-care. So if you haven't done so already, go to your workbook and start filling out your self-care plan. And if you don't have a lot to add to it right now, that's okay. We're going to teach you some tools that will be able to help you add to that self-care plan. And again, you can reference the book, The Grief Experience, Tools for Acceptance, Resilience, and Connection, which can be found on Amazon in February of 2024. And that's going to have 25 tools in that book, which is absolutely amazing. And it's from a variety of authors, all with a unique form of grief and their own unique grief story. In that book, there is stories about grief due to a death of a loved one, traumatic grief, suicide, overdose loss, pet loss, divorce, cultural bereavement, infertility, so many different kinds of loss. I truly believe that whoever picks up that book is going to be able to relate to at least one of those authors in that book. So again, each of those authors shares a tool that can help somebody so you can add those to your self-care plan. So in our next module, we're going to be talking about physical benefits of moving our body when we're grieving. So stay tuned.